So I started off with the Opera Rose and then the Permanent Rose, and I've dropped a little bit of the pink into the Permanent Rose as well to create a nice sort of warm orange. I'm wetting the paper with my large 1.5 inch soft brush, so a nice large mop brush. You don't have to wet it everywhere, you can leave some dry patches as well, so it's quite nice to have hard edges here and there as well as soft edges. I'm using my size 6 brush and I'm just tickling this paint onto the wet surface, just letting it bleed. The paper is Saunders Waterford cold pressed paper, 300 grams. It's on a block, and I put some washi tape just around the edge there, so when I remove that at the end of the painting, I'll have a nice white border that really presents your painting nicely. It can make all the difference. So I'm just painting in the Opera Rose here, lots of water as well. And it's just to really get these very pale tonal colours at the beginning of the painting. And then when I'll let that dry and I'll paint sort of mid to dark tones on top later, hopefully to bring this little rose to life. But it keeps everything really loose. And to keep it even more loose, I'm spritzing it so that pink runs a little bit into the background. I know a lot of you on the Patreon poll did ask about how to make backgrounds and negative space. Well, sometimes it's quite nice to do something like that and spray it so it becomes your colours on your positive shapes become part of the background on your negative shapes. It's quite a nice way of creating harmony in your colour mixing and in your painting. So I'm starting on this main rose here. A little bit is wet on dry as well, so I'm getting some hard edges, and I'm using a little bit of the yellow with a tiny touch of the pink, and I'm mixing up a kind of a pinky lavender colour here. So it's Ultramarine and the Opera Rose, because at the top of that flower there's the petal does look a little bit violet, sort of pinky violet colour. Try not to touch the yellow too much because you'll end up with such a nice light brown. So I'm sort of painting the violet colour at the top and then pushing it down rather than pulling the yellow up. So I popped a little bit on this bottom leaf as well, and along with the Opera Rose with a pinch of yellow. If you put too much yellow, it's going to go orange. So you've got this real fine balance, but it's it's sort of a great practice and challenge for you in colour mixing. And remember to keep it really dilute. It's a great idea as well to use the largest brush possible, a round brush I'm using, to really load it so you've got plenty of paint on your brush, but it's got a nice point on the brush as well, and so you get some detailing as well. But as you can see here, I've got lots of paint, there's puddles on there. And what happens in flower painting when you paint loose like this, when you're very, very wet, especially in the first stage, it can create some very exciting happy accidents. And the tip is, don't fiddle with it, just paint it on there and just let the paint do all of the work. You're kind of guiding it and then they're kind of just getting on with it. So this is almost wet on dry here. It was probably wet previously, but it's dried off a little bit. That's fine. And what I've done is just putting clean water there now, just to kind of dilute and create a pale sort of part on the petal there, and just sort of dropping in and tickling in some of this pink here. Always try and get fresh paint as well, so your brush doesn't get too muddy. And do take your time, and if it dries too quickly, just give it a spray. At this stage, we're just creating very loose kind of colour effects here, mainly just using the pink and the yellow. And this is actually just yellow here. I decided to paint a lot more of the yellow in the centre. It creates a lovely light, this yellow. And here comes the twig. I dipped it into some alizarin crimson. It's kind of a reddy sort of pink, alizarin crimson, quite dark pink. It's quite useful for creating sort of tonal values. But it's just a bit of playing here to create sort of frilly edge here. So the twig has actually been dipped into neat paint, so it's straight from the tube. So it's really quite undiluted. And I've just painted this bit here, and then I'm adding a little bit of the Opera Rose up here with my size 6 brush, painting damp into damp or wet into wet, and it's got a little bit carried away there with all the paint. So, but that doesn't matter. It's the first stage, and if it all goes wrong, just spritz it, see what happens. So this is a kind of, I think it's a rose that's kind of on its way out. It's wilted. One of you did say in the Patreon poll as well about roses in all their different forms, and that's why I chose this particular painting, because you've almost got dead roses there, ones that are wilting, big sort of open roses, then you've got the buds and then the buds opening, and I thought this was brilliant for creating all these different effects. So, and you know, I really quite like painting the ones that are dying as well, because they've got so much texture and they're lovely and dark. So I'm using a watercolor pencil here. It's a dark, maybe a grey or even a black, just for the centre of the rose here. And it's slightly wet, so it's bleeding. Now, this was a little bit of a mistake, because I did see a dark there, but it was quite wet there. So I'm going to deal with that little dark watercolour mark that I made in that rose just above. So I will be coming back to it. But I'm using my size 4 brush, and I'm just dropping in a little bit of Quinacridone gold there. Actually, it's not my size 4, it's my size 2 brush. And I'm doing the same in the centre of the centre rose. Now, I'm using the size 2, lots of clean water here, well, cleanish, lifting off the excess and just trying to get rid of that mark. I'm not that experienced at getting rid of watercolour pencil marks, but that will be okay. I've pushed it back, it'll be fine. So I'm using a little bit of yellow and Prussian blue here, painting. It's almost wet on dry actually, using my size 6 brush and just painting these really pale colours on first, lovely and watery, and then just dropping in slightly sort of darker greens, just adding creamier blue to the right hand side, light coming from top left. And it's just quite nice, and just dabble. I love painting buds and things like that more than I would flowers, because you can really sort of play around with them. I'm using the twig here just to pull that paint up to that very sort of pointy bit at the top there. It's quite exciting to do. And I'm using the twig again, scratching into the surface of the paper, so you do make a permanent scratch and the darker paint runs into it to create a very thin line. If you don't like doing this, you can always wait for your painting to dry and then use a small brush, thin little round brush, and paint these marks in wet on dry. There's always ways around it, and I always say it's my plan A, my plan B and my plan C. If plan A doesn't work, I've always got something up my sleeve, and it's just nice because it gives you more confidence this way as well, to know there's other alternatives. You can see there I almost drew the stems there with my brush. I've mixed up a little bit of pink, the yellow and a touch of blue to paint these sort of stems that are quite sort of reddish in tone. You can use a bit of burnt sienna if you wanted to for this as well, but I quite like using the alizarin with a touch of the yellow just to create this lovely colour, with maybe a bit of the blue to make it darker. You can also use a little bit of quinacridone gold for these stems as well. So I'm still using my size 6 brush. If you find that's too big, you can always go to a smaller brush. Do what makes you feel comfortable, especially when you're painting very fiddly areas. And I'm just painting this larger bud now that's opening up, so it's got a little bit more interest here where I'm painting using quinacridone gold, touch of blue as well. And you can use ultramarine or Prussian blue, and if you don't have those, you can use cobalt blue or cerulean or phthalo blue. You can practice them. I love varying my colours sometimes, trying out different colours. Even the indigo and yellow make some beautiful greens as well. So I'm just mixing up. It's more of a mid-tone green here. As you remember on the tonal charts that I just released recently on the memberships, it's just that it's important to think about the tone. And this sort of stage in the painting, which is my first stage, it's all about the light, the white of the paper to begin with, then the lightest tones and then mid-tones. You don't want to go too much darker unless we go back to that sort of flower that's wilting on the left there where I've used the dark watercolor pencil. Yes, you can go there. It's probably going to be the last time I paint that area, so you can go dark there. Actually used a bit of red here. It's Pyrrole red, and it's quite a nice colour, but you can use cadmium red, any red will do, and I added a bit of yellow to it just to sort of mix up the colours here. But don't you think these are delightful colours? They're so joyous and pretty. Now, if you can choose your own photograph for this. If you've got a photograph of roses or a roses photograph you'd like to paint, try the same techniques. You know, you can sort of plan your own colour charts and have a go. So I'm spattering there as well, and I've gone in now with my twig with a mixture of the Alizarin Crimson and Quinacridone Gold to create this darker colour here, and scratching it in, it's created some really nice effects. Never underestimate the importance of water. Use lots of water this stage. It can create some wonderful effects. You can't even see them now. They'll work later. So really experiment with water and dropping it into your colours. It's so much fun to do. So I'm just painting some of the light colours, light tonal values on the leaves, pretty much now wet on dry. It's been a while now since I wet my paper, and that's fine. If I want a soft edge, I can just spritz it. I'm just adding in now a little bit of a stronger colour here as well on the leaves, just mixing it up. Used a little bit of the Quinacridone Gold, again lots of water, softening things as I go, just really sort of being flicking with the brush to create some of those marks. Try not just to draw an outline and fill it in, try to sort of paint the shape with your brush, sort of press down and lift up, and just try different mark making with your brush. It can be so much fun to do. And this is a very dark green here. It's a little bit of the indigo, and I'm dropping it into this much lighter yellow green, so lots more yellow, less blue, and I'm just using the tip of the brush to create some marks on the leaf wet on dry, using my size 6 brush. And now I'm using my twig, and I've gone in with a very dark paint. I believe it's indigo, maybe with a little touch of the alizarin, or you could use the Quinacridone Gold just to create that centre there, and then painting some of the veins and some of the marks, the dark marks, with that indigo and yellow, damp into damp. And I'm going to do the same thing with this leaf I just painted a second ago. It's still quite wet actually, but just dropping in these darks, damp into damp, or wet into wet even, depending on your surface of your paper, or you can paint damp, creamier paint into the wet surface. I thought I'd include that. I've changed my water. I changed my water a lot through the tutorial because it's important to keep fresh water, especially when you're using these reds and greens. I've just popped a little bit of Brusho on there, and now I'm spritzing it to reawaken it. If you're new to my membership and you want to know a little bit more about Brusho, I will put a link in the description below. But it's a really exciting medium and creates some lovely textures. So I'm painting pretty much wet on dry here, this rose to the right, just painting on the yellow, the permanent yellow, with my size 10 brush with lots and lots of water. And now I'm just dropping in, sort of not actually on top of the yellow, just touching the edge of the yellow, the opera rose, so that it, as I was saying before, let those colours do the work and let that yellow and pink bleed together, and you'll end up with this beautiful shade. Whereas sometimes when you mix them in a palette, they're a bit too orangey looking. So I hope you found that useful, but there's such a pretty combination. As you can see, I'm just tapping in the colour and letting it bleed. This is a lovely dark colour here. I've used a little bit of the Quinacridone Magenta and the Indigo. So sorry, because I'm using quite a large sheet here. It's 16 by 12. This bottom part, I wasn't aware when I was filming. I slightly cut it here. So, but it's just sort of painting this rose, this dead rose at the bottom here. I just love these colours, and Indigo and the Magenta make such beautiful colour combination. I'm using my twig now just to dip into the Indigo as well, just to paint these marks in the centre. And remember, add water to this as well. I think I've actually dropped a little bit of green shade in there also, but it's really nice just to get the twig, almost just to draw with the twig as well into the damp paint to create textures and lines and a little bit of definition. And this is a little bit of the Alizarin Crimson with a touch of the Quinacridone Gold to create almost like a brown shade, which is lovely. And this almost looks green. It's the Indigo with a touch of pink with a tiny touch of yellow. So it's all these kind of beautiful grey shades, which I love. And I'm just sort of painting in the stems as well. And I'm just painting this very, very watery shade here. And you could use Ultramarine with a tiny speck of yellow, lots and lots of water. I decided to add a little bit more yellow there. I'm going in with the indigo and a little tiny bit of that pink that's mixed with it as well, using my twig with a lovely dark creamy colour, just sort of drawing in the edge, and that sort of damp creamy colour will bleed in slightly. You'll get a lovely sort of dark soft edge there. But it's quite nice working in this way. It's lovely and loose. You can be quite experimental. If I was to give you one tip, they say, one tip, Karen, what could you tell us? I'd definitely say less is more, but just try to paint once in an area. Obviously, you may drop 2 colours in, but just keep moving on. Let things dry, see what happens, work on top. Don't keep labouring your paint, because it gets dull, it gets muddy, and you lose the light. And actually it makes you tight. You get all, sort of tightened up, so try to be a lot more loose. And if you find you're tightening up, just give a spatter or walk away and just come back to it if you feel you're tightening up. And I've been there, trust me, so many times. I find I tighten up when I'm short of time as well. So always make sure you've allowed yourself a bit of time to paint. So I'm using the size 10 here, just using lovely grey greens here, ultramarine with a tiny little bit of the yellow, and just varying the colours. You can also use a little bit of the Prussian blue with a touch of yellow as well, lots and lots of water. And this is my size 6 brush, and I'm using some indigo now mixed with the Quinacridone gold. And if you don't have Quinacridone gold, you can use something like raw sienna or yellow ochre. They're just not bright yellows, they are more sort of earthy yellows. So I'm painting this sort of damp into wet paint. So I love the way it kind of pushes that wet paint away, it kind of repels it, and you get these lovely effects as well, different marks. And you can see these leaves, they're really kind of coming to life. And the other thing is to note that the leaves of roses are very sort of spiky at the end, so you can use a card to pull those out, the tip of the card. And I'm also using the card to scratch in the veins and the centres as well. That card is such a brilliant little tool. It really is. It does so much. But they look very effective there. And remember, with the leaves, less is more. The stars of the show are your roses. So don't sort of overdo them. And I'm giving a little spatter of the indigo there on top of the leaves and around them as well, to create marks on the leaves as well. Sometimes though, you can get them on other flowers, so just get your brush with some clean water, dilute it, and then wipe away with your paper towel. And then what I would suggest is mix up some fresh colours and then repaint that area. You can wait for it to dry, but I couldn't wait, so I've made up some lavender colour. That's the ultramarine with the opera rose, and I'm painting this wet in wet. And I've also dropped a little bit more of the opera rose in there on its own, wet into wet as well, just lifting out with my clean damp brush some paint to allow a little bit of light to show on that petal. I'm using the size 6 brush with a mixture of the ultramarine and yellow, and I'm painting in some stems here, wet on dry, and then just diluting and using water as well to create some light effects there. I'm dropping in now some of the indigo, wet into wet, just to create some darks along there. I'm painting this other sort of dead rose here that's sort of very dark, and I'm using some of the indigo and the yellow there, and just sort of a lot of indigo. And I'm using my plastic card instead of the twig. I'm drawing with the plastic card some of these squiggly sort of lines there to create some texture and details, dropping in water as well. This is a little bit of Quinacridone gold with the Paynes grey. I've swapped to my size 2 brush. I just wanted some really thin pointy edges on the old petals here, and lots of yummy darks. Not just go for one colour for a dark, always add other colours and not just the same colour. Maybe add a bit of pink or Quinacridone gold. And I'm actually painting this I'm pushing it into the pink there as well, painting in some more stems using the indigo with the Quinacridone gold, and again dropping in darker colours, and it becomes quite exciting. It's a little roadmap of paint here. This is a little bit of ultramarine with a tiny touch of yellow. It's a very blue-green, very cool colour, and sorry about my hand being in the way there, but just sort of keeping it really simple and painting the leaves now on this rose at the top here, again with the ultramarine and a touch of yellow, working mainly wet on dry here. The paper could be a little bit damp, but I think it's mostly dry now, which is fine. And I'm using my size 10 brush. I've added a little bit of the ultramarine with a bit more yellow there, and then dropping in the indigo. As you can see, I'm really kind of not going back over things, not labouring things, keeping things really loose, just painting in the basic shapes, but varying the colours. Take your time with this. Don't rush. Enjoy it. It's actually so therapeutic. I love painting in this way. It's creative, and you're using these different techniques, different colours, and you're in this whole rose of garden world. I just totally get drawn in. I had a comment on YouTube. Someone asking me, did I paint any differently if I was sad or happy? And I think once I start painting, I don't feel anything except that emotion that I feel when I'm painting. So I do feel something. I just feel totally wrapped in what I'm doing. I forget about everything in my life. I'm just totally focused on what I'm doing. I have the same thing when I'm teaching as well. The only time I have a problem is when I'm a bit limited with time, and that's why I don't think it's good. I think it's always good to allow yourself the time to paint. You saw I put a bit of black Brusho on there, and you can see all the different colours that black Brusho have. And I've given it a little spritz there, and it's really kind of created some lovely textures around those leaves. Now this area here, I'm actually spraying the paint here. It's still damp, and I'm using my spritzer bottle to allow all the paint to run down to create a background of the rose colours in the background. So we've got pink and yellow in the background. Just to say though, the two roses on the left, it's a second stage part of this painting. I didn't realise the camera wasn't turned on. So I've dried my painting, painted on top, and realised the camera wasn't working. So apologies for that. But what I'm doing here with this rose on the right hand side is I'm painting in exactly the same way. So I'm mixing up a little bit of the opera rose with a touch of the yellow, and just painting around the edge with my size 10 brush, wet on dry, and just varying the colours. I've also got a little bit of permanent rose squeezed out. And if you don't like something, do what I'm doing here, wet it with your brush with clean water, and then just lift off so that you go back to your underpainting. Just wet it very gently so you don't disturb the paint underneath. So I'm basically almost drawing an outline with this watery paint to show the sort of structure of this rose here where the darker areas are. And I'm just sort of printing and pressing with my size 10 brush as well to get all these kind of almost abstract marks that you get in the shape of the rose there, keeping everything really loose. I've swapped to my size 2 brush here, and I'm just painting on some of the permanent rose now, damp into wet, just to show some of the dark edges on the rose here, just to give a little bit of structure to the rose without getting too tight. What I did with that centre rose, which is pretty much what I'm doing now, I painted some darks in the centre as I'm doing on this bud with a little bit of alizarin crimson with my size 6 brush. I spattered, and I also dropped a little bit of Brusho in as well and spritzed it, so I got some really nice effects going on there. And of course I turned it upside down then and sprayed, which is quite, as you can see, the yellow ran, so it's a really nice thing to do. So it's just building up that little bit more detail, which is what I'm doing here now with the stems, just little bits of dark here and there. A really good tip is when you're painting your next stage, don't paint all over your light areas. Look for those mid to dark tones and use clean water and a damp brush and sort of blend away the darks away from the light so you don't pull it all over the light. So it's really important to do that. And if you feel you're losing it, just lift off as what I'm doing here. The light is so important, and it's so easy to lose in watercolour painting because the paint kind of travels a little bit. I'm using some of the indigo and yellow here and just sort of popping in a few dark tones now. So I'm using my size 6 brush and just really disciplining myself not to lose the light and mid-tones, just to pop those darks in. Sometimes if you half close your eyes, you can sort of see those darks, and you know, sort of just discipline yourself just to paint them there and don't let your brush go too far over your light area. So I'm actually working into this rose again. Obviously I sprayed off a lot of what I did earlier to create this sort of soft pink background, so I've decided to go back in and paint a little bit more on there. So I've used a little bit of the opera rose with the yellow actually mixed together this time. You get a really pretty sort of pink colour there. Painting this wet on dry. I don't want to get too detailed. I just want to give the impression of the rose there. Just painting on these darks, using a little bit more of the opera rose with my size 6 brush. I'm really trying to discipline myself to paint the minimum amount of lines. You can so overwork these roses. I just want to just sort of pick out a few little mid and dark tones there and soften as I go. I decided to use a touch of ultramarine in the pink. Just be careful if you've got some yellow in there as well, it might go too brown. But you can have a smidge of yellow in there, but it'll be okay with the pink and the blue. And I'm just sort of really drawing the centre there with that colour, with the pink, and a touch of the alizarin crimson as well, just to make this a bit darker, working wet on dry, just to sort of form that centre there, the way the petals curling around each other, tighter in the centre, still using that size 6 brush, working wet on dry. And I'm going to rinse my brush now, and I'm just going to use the damp brush just to soften those hard edges that I've painted there and to blend them back so they look sort of like, create a little bit of shadow there. So just really sort of work at that just to soften everything out, all those sort of lines, and push them back a little bit. I decided to put another petal at the top here, trying things out, and I'm using the opera rose with my size 6 brush, but I didn't really like it, so I'm just going to wet that, get rid of it with my paper towel, and hey presto, it's sort of pushed back and it's absolutely fine. And I'm adding a little bit of the alizarin crimson now, just to paint a darker centre, really to draw the eye in there. And I think I'll use a bit of the Brusho, the alizarin crimson, on the wet surface, and create some nice dark textures in the centre there. And I'm just using my spritzer bottle to activate the Brusho. I'm using my large flat 1.5 inch brush, nice large soft brush, and as you can see I've dipped it into my water pot, so it's really wet, and it's activating some of the black Brusho there that was still, some of the powdered particles were still there, but I'm just going around wetting the negative space, the background, just very carefully. If Brusho gets activated, it's absolutely fine, it's all part of the yummy textures. And I'm just wetting this top part here as well, just with all this dilute water. If you find your brush is getting a bit contaminated, just rinse again and just dilute again. And I don't mind if I'm going over the flowers and things like that, and I'm happy for things to smear if they're still wet. It creates a background for you. It just creates these soft shadows in the background. I was tempted to paint the garden behind, but I thought it was just going to be a bit busy, so I've just kept it really simple, using this sort of grey blue here. You can use a bit of cerulean with indigo, and I'm using a little bit of yellow here, wet into wet as well, just to create these really soft sort of atmospheric colours, to let those roses come forward and not the background. So it's keeping it really cool, and I'm working my way in around the sort of more intricate areas using my size 10 brush. It would be quite nice to put a little bit more black Brusho at the bottom here while the paper's wet. I quite liked what happened on the left hand side there at the bottom, so I'm just sprinkling a little bit of the Brusho. Remember, less is more with Brusho. A little goes a long way. I'm just developing here the centre of this right poppy, and with my size 6 brush, and I'm spattering the background with some of the pink opera rose as well, giving my brush a little rinse and spattering some of the orange colour. Almost looks like maybe there's a rose there in the distance, and I'm just softening some of the Brusho. I picked up some of the black Brusho there and just painted a little bit at the top, which is quite nice. It almost frames everything, but you know, this is all very, very loose. I thought I'd sprinkle a little bit of sea salt just in the centre here, and I've allowed it to dry, and you can see it's created some nice textures in the centre, removing the washi tape, and you can see there's a really nice white border there. I'm delighted with my painting, and I really enjoyed painting it, and I hope you enjoyed watching and that it inspires you to have a go at painting these loose roses or something of your own. And if you have any questions about this tutorial, please put them in the comments section below. And if you'd like to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, where you'll get updates of my latest tutorials. And if you'd like to learn more about watercolor painting and get access to exclusive videos and downloadable outline sketches, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching again. Happy painting. Bye for now.